Hey, this is Megan from the White Whisk, and welcome to the Amoretti Test Kitchen. Today we're going to be baking a festive cranberry cardamom white chocolate macaron, which is just as delicious as it sounds. And we're going to be using the Amoretti almond flour and also the cranberry compound. So let's get baking. To begin our cranberry cardamom white chocolate macarons, we're going to work backwards a little bit and start with one of the garnishes, which is the sugared cranberries, because they do take a little bit of time to dry. So we want to make these far enough in advance so we can give those plenty of time to dry and we can finish them off. So sugared cranberries are quintessentially the most prominent thing I can think of when it comes to festive holiday garnishes. And you can use these on desserts, you can use these on a charcuterie board, you can just eat these straight up. They are so good and they are surprisingly easy to make. So let's get started. To begin our sugared cranberries, we are going to make a simple syrup by combining sugar and also water in a saucepan, equal parts. And you can adjust this if you want to make a big old batch of sugared cranberries. Just keep the ratio 1 part sugar, 1 part water, and up the cranberries. And it is super easy. So I'm going to put this on a medium heat, and we just want to dissolve that sugar into the water. And you can kind of swirl it around in the pan. Another quick note, if your grocery store is out of fresh cranberries, you can definitely use frozen for this. So take advantage of that. Okay, so we can see our sugar starting to bubble a little bit. You can kind of swirl it around, let that sugar dissolve in there. And if you want to help it along a little bit, you can also whisk it around a tiny bit too. All right, we're getting close. It's starting to look a little more clear. Okay, I'm gonna take that off the heat and swirl it around a little bit just so we can see what it's looking like without the bubbles. We're good. Okay. All right, so next we are going to pour our cranberries into the simple syrup. And then we are going to just gently stir them around and make sure they are coated in the simple syrup. Give it a little swirl. Okay, and now we are going to use a slotted spoon and we are going to gently scoop those out, drain off the excess simple syrup. And then we're gonna spread them onto a baking sheet with parchment paper, or you could use a silicone mat, whatever you have on hand. And then we kind of wanna scoot them apart so they don't dry super stuck together. All right. And once we get those scooched apart, we're just gonna let them dry for 2 hours, and then we'll revisit them and roll them in some granulated sugar, and then they'll be all set to go. It's as easy as that. So let's move on to the next step of our recipe. Next, we're gonna move on to our cranberry white chocolate cardamom ganache. Once again, planning ahead. Ganache can take a little bit of time to set, so it's at a great consistency for piping onto our macarons. So we're gonna make this about 2 hours in advance, so it gives it plenty of time. First, we're gonna be taking our heavy cream and pouring it into our white chocolate. Then we're gonna stir it around and make sure all those little chips have been coated in that white chocolate. It's okay if it's not submerged. We just wanna make sure everything has come into contact with the heavy cream. We're also gonna add in just a little pinch of salt, just to bring some balance to that sweetness. So next, we are gonna be doing one of the quickest ways to make ganache, but I just wanna give you fair warning. We are going to be doing it in the microwave, and we want to do it in very short bursts. White chocolate can very easily overheat, so we wanna make sure we do just short intervals in the microwave. Give it a good stir after each trip into the microwave so we don't overheat our white chocolate. So we're gonna start by popping it in for 20 seconds. And then we're gonna take it out and we're gonna give it a good stir and see where we're at. So you can see that we're starting to get a little melty here. All right, and we're gonna pop it back in for another 10 seconds this time. Let's check on it again. Now it can kind of feel tedious, but it is better to go slow and steady rather than to overheat the white chocolate and have it split. And you can see even after a few moments that it starts to melt a little bit more from the residual heat. So give it a couple of seconds while you're stirring and just see if we can work out a few more of those little bits of chocolate. So next we are going to be adding in some of the cranberry compound. And I just want to say how much easier this is going to make this process rather than having to purchase cranberries, wash them off, cook them down, run them through a sieve and create a puree, and then add it to your ganache. Instead, we can just take a compound or an artisan even and put it straight in, and it makes life so much easier. So next we're gonna sprinkle in our cardamom. Cardamom is one of those spices I could put in just about anything. It is so good. And we're gonna fold it in. Awesome, so now we have this gorgeous silky ganache and we are going to put some plastic wrap on it and let it set at room temperature until we're ready to use it. All right, the next step in our recipe is the cardamom macaron shells. Macarons have quite a reputation for being finicky, but I'm gonna give you a lot of tips and tricks along the way. And if you are looking for even more, you can also go check out Amoretti's Macaron 101 video and post. Has a ton of great information, tons of tips and tricks to help you feel confident going into your first batch of macarons. We're gonna begin by putting our egg whites in a bowl of an electric mixer. Make sure there's no yolks in this. If you accidentally break a yolk in there, I would recommend getting a fresh batch of egg whites. So let's go ahead and pour it in. And we're also gonna add a little bit of a pinch of cream of tartar. This is going to help stabilize the meringue, which is the foundation of your macaron shells. So add that in there as well. Next, we're gonna turn our mixer on and get whisking. And while this is whisking, we are gonna begin pouring in our granulated sugar and just slowly sprinkle that in. Before you begin making your shells, I do recommend getting your baking sheets all prepped and ready with a silicone mat. If you can find one with the template of the macaron circles, it's awesome. It's super helpful for being consistent. If not, you can also take a sheet of parchment paper and trace those circles using like a little cookie cutter or even a small cup or a dish and create your own template to slide underneath the macaron mat. So, once you have those ready, you're also going to want to prep your piping bag. So you need a large one for this one because this recipe will fill this guy up. Put a size 1A piping tip in here, round opening, and we're gonna set it in our glass. So we're gonna get it all ready to go. And that way we can pour our macaron batter in here hands-free. So we're gonna keep whisking this until it has reached stiff peaks, and we will kind of stop along the way and I'll show you the different stages of where the peaks are, and then we'll stop once it becomes stiff. Okay, so you can see our egg whites have begun to become fluffy and light. This is a little more of a soft peak. As you can see, it's flopping over, doesn't have a ton of structure to it quite yet. So we're gonna keep whisking. Okay. And while our meringue is whisking, we are going to sift our powdered sugar and our almond flour together just to make sure everything is super finely incorporated. Okay, and then let's do our powdered sugar. Are you even baking if powdered sugar and flour isn't flying all over your kitchen? I don't think so. All right, let's check on this meringue. It's looking much stiffer now. So take a look at that. Glossy, white, gorgeous meringue. One of my favorite moments in baking. I'm gonna give it even just another minute or two just to make sure it is super stiff. But first, I'm gonna go ahead and add in the cardamom to our dry ingredients. So this is ready to go once our meringue is done. Now let's whisk together the almond flour, powdered sugar, and the cardamom. The cardamom's also gonna add a really pretty little speckling to your shells. I love those little visual cues that tell you something about the dessert you're about to eat before you even take a bite. All right, looks good, smells good, moving on. All right, so this is one of my cues I like to look for in a meringue for when it's ready. You can see that it's balled up in the whisk here before I even take it out of the bowl. Okay, so now we are going to incorporate our dry ingredients into our meringue. And I just want to make a quick note. If you find that your macarons maybe aren't working quite properly, you can experiment with different stiffness in your meringue. Some bakers prefer like just barely stiff. Some people prefer super stiff, and it can also vary between the different methods like Swiss and French and Italian. So one of my biggest tips with macarons is just to experiment and find out what works for you in your kitchen, whether that's different stiffness in meringue, different oven temperature, different resting time. This is one of those things that practice truly does make progress and can help you find a way to have successful macarons. So we're gonna begin folding in our dry ingredients, and we're gonna scoop around the edge and bring it through. We're gonna be knocking out a little bit of the air in this so that our macaron batter has a nice flow to it. You just wanna make sure you scrape those dry ingredients from the bottom, bring them to the top so you don't have any little pockets of that on the bottom. And these shells are gonna have a really pretty ivory hue to them. With the almond flour and the cardamom in there, they'll be a little bit of an off-white shade. But if you want them to be a little brighter white, you could also add white food coloring. If you want them to be super wintry and snow-like, we could add white coloring, or even just a tiny, tiny, tiny drop of blue or violet will help cancel out some of the yellow tones. So there's another little tip if you're looking for white shells. Okay, so you can see we're starting to get more of a uniform batter here. Make sure to scrape your spatula along the way so you don't have any little pockets of dry ingredients hanging out up there. Okay, so now we're getting closer. You can see how thick it is right now. Like, this is pretty chunky. This would definitely qualify as undermixed macaron batter. Macaronage is one of the trickiest parts for most bakers to kind of nail down, and it truly does just take practice to get a feel for what consistency you're shooting for. But I'll give you a couple tips on how to tell when your macaron batter is ready. Okay, so we're still pretty thick. So now we're gonna begin mostly just knocking the air out of the batter. And you can do this in a couple of ways. You can kind of continue doing the same motion, or you can even just like spread the batter around your bowl and then bring it back down and see what your consistency is like. This is when I try to start checking my batter, because even a few folds can make a really big difference in the consistency. So right now we see we're still thick, we're still a little chunky, so we want to keep going. So I'm going to check about every 5 folds or so. Okay, are we looking? Okay, we had a little longer of a ribbon there. We want to get a pretty much a continuous ribbon for at least a few seconds. Another thing I really like to do, because sometimes different macaron recipes can have a different ideal consistency, this next method works for just about anyone because you are kind of simulating the movement your batter is going to go through when you pipe it and then tap it on the tray. But I'll scrape my batter down to the bottom of the bowl and then give it a little wiggle back and forth. This just kind of gives me a preview of how it might settle once it's had a little bit of movement. So we still see some little lines here, and then we have our flow not quite there yet. We're getting really close, so I'm going to give it like just a few more. Okay, so we can see we have a little bit more of a continuous ribbon there. It's not breaking as much. So I'm gonna try my little wiggle test one more time. Okay, so scrape it down to the bottom. Give it a little wiggle. And if you're just starting out, I would actually recommend staying on the safe side and going even slightly undermixed, because undermixed, it still will function and it will still have structure. But overmixed usually makes your shells very fragile and difficult to use. All right, this is looking a lot better. We have a ribbon going. Here's another test that you can do, is you can do a figure 8 test. So get a good amount of batter and then see if you can create a figure 8 with your batter. Okay, yep, so that was a thick ribbon, but I got a figure 8. So I'm gonna stop and I'm going to move on to piping. Next, we're gonna be pouring our batter into our prepared piping bag. Okay. So next, let's talk a little bit about piping technique. Something that you want to make sure to do with macarons is hold your bag as close to like straight up and down as you can. If you end up kind of piping it from the side, it's going to be a little lopsided, might make your shells a little wonky. You're also going to start right in the center and apply pressure and just keep it right in the center. Don't swirl it around. That's also something that can make your shells slightly off circle shape. All right, so we are going to begin piping. So do a twist at the top. That way you can kind of keep the tension down here in the bag instead of squishing it in the middle and sending the tension both ways. So we're going to begin piping it right in the center. And then you're going to do a small circular flick. We don't want to pull straight up because that's going to give you a little bit of a peak in the middle. That'll be a little harder to settle down into the batter. Just keeping it right in the center of the circle, straight up and down, small circular flick. And you can already see with the ones that I piped at the beginning, those peaks are already starting to settle down a little bit. That is a sign of a batter that has been macaronaged to a good consistency. If it's under macaronaged, your shells will be a little bit more on the bumpy side, which once again, it's not gonna ruin them, but it's just a technique thing that you can just practice and improve. And I'm actually pretty shaky when it comes to baking, but something I like to do to help my bag stay steady is I'll just take my opposite hand and just give it a little bit of a guide. Just controlled shakiness. Work with what you got. And as your batter starts getting a little bit more empty, just scoot it down, retwist, make sure you have that even pressure. So next we need to bang our trays to knock out some of those air bubbles and also help those shells just settle down just a pinch more to work out a few of those little subtle lines. A little trick for when you're banging the trays on the counter, some bakers really like to tap it from the bottom. I prefer to tap my trays onto a dish towel or maybe like a dish drying mat to kind of just dampen the noise because it is very loud. So I'm just gonna give it a few smacks on each side. You don't want to go too crazy with it because the corners of these little mats can kind of pop up on you. But this is just going to help work out some of those air bubbles. And you can see on the shells, there's a few little pockets of where those shells have popped some bubbles. Next, we're gonna go in with either a toothpick or a scribe tool, and you can kind of just do a little gentle nudge on some of those little craters where the holes were from the air bubbles popping. Or if you see any larger lumps, like I can kind of see, or like some of the peaks, if they haven't quite settled as much as you would prefer, you can kind of just go in and I just kind of like do small little like swirly motions and then try to just like gently work it out. Don't stress about the little ones, honestly. If you see any large bumps for air bubbles, I would recommend popping those, but mostly just get the bigger stuff. Okay, you can see the difference after I kind of just go over it. So like, let's look at this one right here. I'm just gonna put the toothpick right down in there, just do minuscule little size swirls to just help that batter even out a little bit more. So let's talk about consistency while we're doing this. If we already talked a little bit about what undermixed batter might look like, it's gonna have a lot of ridges in it. Maybe some of those little peaks wouldn't have settled down. But let's also talk about undermixed. When you have undermixed batter, your batter is just gonna spread out when you're trying to pipe it. It's gonna be a lot harder to control your piping. But if it is kind of that middle ground, properly macaronaged consistency, it should hold its shape fairly well and just scooch out just a tiny bit once you tap your trays, and most of those lines should meld into the shell itself. Next, we're gonna add a wintry touch with some chunky granulated sugar. This is gonna add a little bit of sparkle, make it a little winter wonderland vibe. So we're just gonna sprinkle this right onto our shells. Make sure you do this while they are still tacky. So shortly after you pipe them and pop out the bubbles, we wanna sprinkle these on, because after they sit out for a little bit, they're gonna form a dry layer and the sprinkles won't stick and they'll just bounce off. Sprinkles are one of the easiest ways to add a little pizzazz to macarons. Makes them super fun, adds a little bit of a texture to it, a little bit of crunch. Next, we want to set our macarons aside to dry, or rest is the term used. So what this is gonna do is it's gonna allow our shells to form a dry outer layer on the skin of the macaron so that when they bake, they don't go up and poof out and crack, but instead they rise up and form that cute little ruffle around the bottom known as the foot that we all know and love about the macaron. So let's set these aside and then we'll bake them later. So the macarons have now rested and have formed a dry layer on the top. Just a little tip as well, if you want to speed up that process, you can put a fan blowing on the macarons and just rotate your tray every 4 or 5 minutes just to make sure they dry out evenly. That speeds up the process a ton. Where I live, it is very humid and I will take all the help I can get drying out my macarons faster. So, little tip, use a fan. A way you can tell if your macarons are done and have formed their skin, you can gently touch the macaron. And if it's not tacky anymore, and if the surface is a little bit more dull and less shiny than it was, that is a sign that they are ready to go in the oven. So let's put them in. And we want to make sure to bake these on the center rack. And off they go. Next, let's prepare our cranberry filling to go in the center of our macarons. This is going to give them a super bright, tart, tangy punch of flavor. So we are going to combine our cranberries, granulated sugar, a little bit of water, some orange juice for a little bit of acidity and flavor, and another pinch of that cardamom. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna combine these in a small saucepan and we're just gonna begin to cook this down. As we go, just make sure everything is stirred together and those cranberries are mixed in with everything. So we're just gonna keep stirring, keep an eye on it while it cooks. And once again, similar to our sugared cranberries, you can totally use frozen for this if that's what you have on hand. If you wanna have some extras of this to serve with your holiday dinner festivities, you can definitely make a double batch and save some for later. So this is the stage you'll begin to start seeing some of those cranberries start to burst. And as this is simmering, you can start to help those berries break down a little bit faster by mashing them with the end of your wooden spoon. Once it's boiling, you can bring your heat down a little bit just so it doesn't get too hot too fast. You can already see how now that they're breaking down, it's getting thicker and it's gonna be also thickened by a little bit of a cornstarch slurry that we're gonna add in just a minute. And just a reminder to make sure you kind of scrape down on the bottom, get in all the corners to make sure there's no pieces stuck on the bottom, cooking way faster than everything else. And while this is simmering, I'm gonna create a cornstarch slurry by adding just a little bit of water to some cornstarch. And I'm gonna mix those together until they're incorporated. And the reason we do this is because if we were to add the cornstarch directly to our filling, it might go in kind of clumpy and some of those clumps might not work out. But if we do a little bit of water with it first, it smooths it out and it incorporates much more efficiently. And something about this recipe is I prefer to make fruit fillings a little bit on the thicker side when it comes to macarons, because your shells will absorb whatever filling you put in them. So if it has a lot of moisture, it has a tendency of making your shells a little bit soggy too quickly. So whenever I create fillings for macarons, I try to thicken them up just a little bit more than I usually would than if it was for a cake, for example. So now that our berries are broken down, they're thickened up, this is pretty much completely broken down at this point. I'm gonna drizzle in the cornstarch slurry as I stir. And now we're gonna cook this for just a few more minutes just to cook out some of that starchy flavor and texture. And then we'll set it aside to cool so we can fill our macarons with it. Okay, and you see how much thicker that is already just with the addition of the cornstarch. All right, and there you have it. Our cranberry filling is all ready to go. So we're gonna set it aside to chill. For a little bit of a garnish on our cranberry cardamom white chocolate macarons, we're gonna create some white chocolate stems. And how we're gonna do this is I melted down some chocolate in a microwave safe bowl in really short bursts, stirring after each trip into the microwave. And then I put it in this piping bag fitted with a number 4 tip. You can also just cut the tip off of a piping bag if you would like that as well. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pipe some straight lines and then we're gonna cover it with sprinkles. So these don't have to be perfect. It will be broken up into smaller segments. So don't worry too much if it's not perfectly straight. So we're gonna do a couple long, consistent lines. Okay, so that's gonna be plenty. Next, we're gonna take some small white sprinkles and we are going to completely cover those lines of chocolate that we just made. And this is a great way to make cake toppers or any type of topper for your desserts. You can customize the sprinkle colors. You can use candy melts in all kinds of different colors and pipe different shapes. It's a really fun way to add some decoration to your desserts in a way that is custom to what your vision is for it. Okay, and when I say covered, I mean covered. We want to have basically every surface of that white chocolate covered in these white sprinkles. All right, and now we are gonna put these in the fridge to let the chocolate set. Next, we're gonna circle back to our sugared cranberries. We are going to remove them from our parchment and we're gonna put them into a bowl of granulated sugar. And as you can see, they're very sticky. So once we get them into the sugar, we're gonna roll them around and they are gonna get covered in that sugar. It's gonna give them a very frosty look. And you can see how pretty these look. These are gonna make such a beautiful garnish. Now we're gonna scoop out our cranberries and shake off that excess sugar. And then we're gonna put them on a separate parchment paper until we are ready to use them. And this amount is gonna give you a little bit extra. That way you can kind of decide between the sizes, which one is your favorite. And then you'll also have a little extra to snack on. So once your shells are out of the oven and are completely baked, make sure to allow them to cool and then carefully remove them from the silicone mat. Then what you're gonna do is you're going to find each shell a matching partner. So you want them to be equal size. And because we pipe these by hand, there's gonna be a smidgen of difference. So just find one that matches really well and lay them out with one side facing up so we can get ready to fill. So our cranberry cardamom ganache has set at room temperature. And now we're going to use it to pipe a ring of ganache around one side of our macarons to create a little dam where our cranberry filling will sit in the middle. Next, we're gonna pipe a ganache ring around each of the macarons. And as you can see, I'm not piping it all the way close to the edge, and that's because I want to give it a little bit of room for when I squish the top macaron shell down, that it has a little bit of room to scooch outward. Otherwise, it'll be overflowing. Next, we're going to move on to our cranberry filling. I've put this into another piping bag, cut off the tip, and we're going to pipe it into the center of each shell. All right, let's set that aside. So next we're gonna take each little matching shell here and we're gonna sandwich it on top of the other side. And I just like to look at them and make sure they're squished down evenly. Sometimes those sprinkles can make them sit a little crooked, so I'll just pick them up and make sure they're nice and even. Next, we're gonna be adding a little dollop of ganache on the top to set our sugar cranberry on. So I'm gonna pipe this in kind of a C shape. Backwards C. At the beginning of the comma, you're gonna put a little bit more pressure so this end is a little bit thicker. And then as we come around, we're gonna release the pressure so it's a skinnier edge on that side. Next, we're gonna come back to our sugared cranberries and we are gonna place one right in that little nook of the comma shape. And just gently press it into the ganache just so it sticks there. And I'm gonna choose the smaller cranberries of the bunch. I think the smaller ones look well in proportion to the macaron size. So once our white chocolate lines have completely set, we are going to break them into a piece that is just slightly shorter than our overall macaron width. So you can expect it to, oh, I've never gotten one off in that big of a piece before. Okay, we're gonna break it anyways, sad day, but break it off in a piece just a little bit longer or a little bit shorter than your macaron. And then we're gonna set it right next to the ganache. I like to have it hovering on both ends a little bit if I can, just so you can really get the dimension of it resting on top. I love the effect that the white sprinkles have paired with the sanding sugar because it all just feels very frosted. It feels like very wintry. And here we have it, our cranberry cardamom white chocolate macarons. These are such a fun festive treat with the presentation and the bright flavors of the season. If you're looking for more recipes, you can find more of mine at thewhitewhisk.com, or you can follow along on Instagram and find me at the.white.whisk. Or you can find more delicious seasonal recipes from Amoretti on their socials, including Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Pinterest as @Amoretti. Enjoy your holiday season. I hope you loved the recipe today. See you next time.